Let me start with a simple but unsettling question. If intelligent life is possible, where is everyone? The universe is vast, extremely old, and filled with billions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars. We now know that many of those stars have planets, and many of those planets are potentially habitable. Life on Earth appeared relatively early, and yet, when we look out into the universe, we see no clear signs of advanced civilizations. This contradiction is known as the Fermi paradox, and it is where our discussion begins. One proposed answer to this paradox is something called the Great Filter. The Great Filter is the idea that there exists one or more barriers in the development of life that prevent civilizations from continuing forward. These barriers are not just difficult. They are either extremely unlikely to pass, almost always fatal, or irreversible when failed. The key idea here is irreversibility. Once a civilization fails the filter, there is no recovery and no second attempt. To understand this, imagine a simplified path from lifeless matter to a long-lasting civilization. First, a habitable planet forms, then life emerges. Then complex cells appear, followed by multicellular organisms, intelligence, and eventually a technological civilization. Beyond that lies a final step that is often ignored: global coordination and restraint. The Great Filter can exist at any point along this path, and we do not know where it is. This uncertainty leads to two very different possibilities. If the Great Filter is behind us, then the early steps of life are extremely rare, and humanity is extraordinarily lucky. In that case, our future may be bright. But if the Great Filter is ahead of us, then most civilizations reach advanced technology and then destroy themselves. In that case, intelligence itself carries a built-in existential risk. This is the more dangerous possibility, and it is the one we must take seriously. At this point, the Great Filter stops being just a scientific question and becomes a philosophical one. Traditional philosophy rarely deals with irreversible failure. Most ethical systems assume that mistakes can be corrected, that societies can recover, and that progress is possible. The Great Filter forces us to consider outcomes where there is no recovery at all, where all future experience simply disappears. This leads to a new way of evaluating philosophical systems. We can ask, how seriously does a philosophy take the possibility of extinction? Does it acknowledge irreversible collapse? Does it address coordination at a global scale? And does it take long-term futures seriously? Using this lens, philosophy becomes not just about truth or meaning, but about survival. To make this comparison concrete, I will use a simple scale from 0 to 5. 0 means the philosophy gives no meaningful consideration to extinction risk. 5 means that existential risk is central and foundational to the system. This scale allows us to compare very different traditions on common ground. At the lowest level are philosophies that effectively ignore the problem altogether. These include ordinary language philosophy, logical positivism, and postmodern or deconstructive traditions. These approaches can be useful for critique or clarification, but when it comes to survival, they dissolve the question rather than answer it. The next level includes philosophies that deal deeply with death and meaning, but only at the individual level. Existentialism, Stoicism, Taoism, and early Buddhism help people live meaningful lives in the face of personal mortality. However, they largely stop at the individual and do not address civilization-level extinction. At the next level are traditions that emphasize continuity, harmony, or moral order. Confucianism, Hindu philosophy, Aristotelian virtue ethics, and process philosophy fall here. These systems value long-term stability, but they often assume some form of correction or renewal. The Great Filter challenges that assumption by allowing for permanent failure. Moving higher, we find philosophies that recognize large-scale failure and coordination problems. Pragmatism, classical liberalism, political realism, and Marxism all acknowledge the possibility of collapse. However, they often assume progress, reform, or revolution as a reset mechanism. The Great Filter questions whether such resets are always possible. At this level, existential risk becomes explicit. Long-term utilitarianism, contractarian approaches to intergenerational justice, Bayesian epistemology, systems theory, cybernetics, and ecological philosophy all directly address long-term outcomes and tail risks. Here, philosophy begins to look like risk analysis. At the highest level are frameworks where survival itself is the organizing principle. Long-termism, existential risk studies, AI alignment philosophy, and certain strands of effective altruism belong here. Cogito presence also fits at this level because it treats extinction as the loss of all future awareness. Without survival, no other values can be realized. It is important to understand why most philosophy falls short here. Philosophical traditions evolved in a world where humanity lacked the power to destroy itself completely. Ethics developed for small populations, short time horizons, and reversible mistakes. Today, that scale mismatch has become dangerous. From the perspective of cogito presence, present awareness is indubitable. Civilization can be understood as extended consciousness across time. Extinction, therefore, is not just biological death, but the termination of all future experience. This makes present decisions morally decisive in a way traditional ethics did not anticipate. The Great Filter is not primarily about aliens. It is about us. It is the test of whether intelligence can coexist with the power it creates. Passing this test may be the central challenge of our time. So I will end with a simple question. What kind of philosophy do we need? Not just to live well today, but to ensure that there is still a future in which living well is even possible.